Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Fantasy Football Series or League, whatever you might want to call it. This is going to be our first episode on the Fantasy League in actually a few months now, with the fantasy season being well over at this point. I did think it would be cool to do a little couple set of videos to take a little break from Subnautica, um, because the NFL draft is actually coming up in 2 days at the time of me making this video. It's going to be on Thursday. So I thought it would be cool to go back through and look at our fantasy football draft we had and pretty much do rankings for like each round. I'll rank each player taken from worst to best. I'll label if they're going to be a hit, meh, or bust player based on what they did throughout the course of the season. And pretty much at the end, we'll see who drafted the best overall. I'll count up all the hits, the mehs, the bust, or the busts. I'll basically just go over who I think did the best overall with their draft based on these rankings. And we're going to kick things off with number 27, or round 27 here, though. And what kind of list would it really be? A rankings list, that is, without Evan getting very last, getting all the way at the bottom. Because fucking Evan, it's Evan. I don't know what else to tell you guys. At the number 12 spot for round 27, we have Scrambled, who drafted an absolute bust in Deontay Foreman, only scoring 89 points on the season. He had two or three good games in games where Khalil Herbert or Roshan Johnson were out. He was able to go in there and actually have good games. But when your player doesn't play 95% of the season, he's not a good player. I can't even force myself to label him a meh. This is overall just a horrible pick, and he really ended up not doing much. So overall, that's definitely the last place. That was an absolute bust for Scrambled and Wiggle Waggled. At number 11, I actually had myself with another absolute bust with Jamison Williams. He had a lot of potential and a lot of promise going into the season. Unfortunately, all of that was pretty much flushed out right off the bat because not only was he suspended for a large portion of the season here, or 4 games out of the season, even when he came back, you could just see the sheer level of inconsistency he had. Sure, he had a couple okay games, a couple good games, but for how inconsistent he was, odds are he was just going to lose you games if you kept starting him. But overall, this is yet another absolute bust, though. He didn't score more than Deontay Foreman, but I figured I'd put him just above Scrambled and Wiggle Waggled, one, because it's Evan, and for two, just because at least my guy had a more solid set of games, I guess you can call it. But overall, both players were absolute busts, though. At number 10, we had MILF, who took Carolina's team defense. This was an absolute bust. With Carolina's team defense, even with it being the Mr. Irrelevant pick, it's still going to be a bust. MILF, um, if you took any other defense on the planet, it probably wouldn't have been this much of a bust. But Carolina actually finishes the third worst team defense in all of fantasy this season for our league scoring. And they had a solid start to the year. They had a good week 4, but after that, everything just hits the fan. They do horrible in pretty much all their games. Don't get me wrong, their defense wasn't that bad in real life, but from fantasy, they just couldn't score fantasy points, unfortunately, and it really held them back, and this was pretty much just a wasted pick for MILF. But so far, we got 3 busts. Now we're going to get into some okay picks. Not the best, but definitely okay, especially for where they are in the draft. At number 9, we have Booty Basher taking Jake Moody. Now, Jake Moody didn't end up being one of the best kickers in the league. He had quite a few bad games. He also had quite a few good games, though. He's not a great player. If anything, I'd say this isn't a good pick, but it's still meh. He had quite a few good games, quite a few bad games. I'd say there's a justifiable argument to put him at mid. Um, at number 8, we have J-Bay. Similar situation, except this time with Nick Folk. With Nick Folk, he was a lot more boomer bust than Jake Moody in the sense of he started out the season with 21, 12, all those higher numbers. But he had those games where he had 2, 4, 5, just a lot of bad games as well. And the bad kind of outweighed the good, which is why he's only at the number 8 spot, unfortunately. But I did think he was slightly better than Jake Moody. At the number 7 spot, I had Mr. Steeler Girl taking Tyrann Mathieu, the safety for the Saints. This is another meh pick. He wasn't horrible, but there was just so many better guys out there, especially on the free agency at the later half of the season. Um, he had 164 points, so overall it wasn't horrible. My problem with him is that he's just so ridiculously inconsistent. He could go from having 1 point to having 7 points to having 8 points to 6 points. He was pretty much all over the place. I'd say this is a meh, but for where it was in the draft, I'd say it's kind of closer to a hit, but overall, it's not the greatest pick, though, because there were a lot of other safeties that outperformed him, especially in terms of consistency. Then at the number 6 spot, we had Dictatorship taking Jake Elliott. Jake Elliott kicked off the season by being the top scoring kicker in the league. He kind of fell off at the halfway point in the season, I want to say. That sounds about right off the top of my head. But he kind of fell off at the halfway point throughout the season. And overall, he just didn't do great after the first part of the season. He did really good for a lot of games, don't get me wrong. But he did have those games slipped in there where he didn't do so great. So overall, I'm going to call this pick a meh. He was one of the highest scoring kickers in fantasy throughout the season, so you can't take that away from him. So it's not a bad pick, but at the same time, I don't think you were too happy starting him every week, if that makes any sense. At the number 5 spot, we got yet another meh. We got Brandon McManus of Big Yawners. This is a kicker that's in a very similar boat where he had games of solid, good upside that he was able to portray pretty much each week, if this fucking thing will load. Where he had games upwards of 20 to 17 points quite a few times, but he also had games where he had 1 to 3 to 0 points. Overall, he was just pretty much all over the place, especially throughout the later course of the season. And overall, he was a pretty good kicker, but I still don't think I can call it a hit. I'd still call that a meh player. At the number 4 spot, you have our first hit, which is going to be Toxic Zenpai taking the Chargers team defense. Now, with the Chargers team defense, if it will ever load, they were a very boomer bust defense, but you could kind of predict when they were going to do good. And what I mean by that is you can see what they do against teams that have bad offenses, like the Jets, for example, like the Raiders. You could usually predict when they'd have their really good games, and that would be really useful for you. If you were smart enough not to start them in like bad games, like say against Buffalo or teams with stronger offenses, the Chargers could have been a really, really good defense for you. And overall, they were one of the highest scoring players in all of fantasy. I guess they're a team defense, so they have a big advantage, but still, I would still consider it more of a hit than a meh, just because if you played your cards right, this is a fantastic pick. At the number 3 spot, we have Pussy taking Donovan Wilson, the safety. This is an absolute hit. I know he only scored a few more points than Tyrann Mathieu, but if you look at that consistency, especially the late stretch of the season, he was so consistent and had a lot of upside on every game on an every game to basis. Game to game basis. I can't talk right now. But anyway, he overall did really good. He missed 2 games at the start of the season, holding him back. He dealt with injuries for a lot of those games, and he still was able to put up these numbers. If it weren't for those top 2 games, he could have got a lot more points probably. But overall, a very consistent season. Only one true bad, or maybe two true bad games throughout the whole season. A very, very solid option, especially this late into the draft. At number 2, we have PMC Wagner taking Jason Myers. This was an absolute hit as well. And with Jason Myers, again, he was very consistent. He's pretty much more consistent than any other kicker in this set of picks right here. He had the most points as well. And overall, he had a lot of upside. He had pretty relative consistent downside. And this was probably one of the better kickers you could get in all of fantasy this season. At the number 1 spot for the round 27, we had Karen's husband taking Chuba Hubbard at the running back position. This is an absolute hit. Don't get me wrong, some of these kickers came close to scoring as many points, but there were so many other kickers that did that, it's not really that great of a draft pick. Remember, we're ranking the draft pick, not the players. So Chuba Hubbard, at the very last round of the draft, getting yourself a starting running back, especially for the second half of the season, you can't get anything better than that. If you can find yourself a startable running back this late into the draft, that is by far better than getting yourself a kicker. Because remember, you can always get yourself a kicker off of free agency. You can get a lot of other positions like safeties off of free agency even later in the season. Running backs are very hard to come by, and being able to just grab up Chuba Hubbard just like this and have yourself a starting running back, that is fantastic. This was a great pick by Karen's husband, the number 1 pick of the round 27 spot. Then we'll move on to round 26. In round 26, the number 12 pick yet again is going to be scrambled and wiggle waggled. Fucking dumbass. Who took Kendre Miller, running back for the Saints, who barely played this season, if I'm not mistaken. I don't believe he actually played more than 2 games, if I'm not mistaken, off the top of my head. He had 43 points. Oh, no, he did. He played a couple more games, but he never really started in more than 2, is what I meant to say. But overall, he had one good game, and even then, you couldn't predict when it was going to happen. Even with Alvin Kamara out, he never had a chance to do anything. This guy was just about fucking useless. So on the flip side of Chuba Hubbard, Scrambled Wiggle Waggle drafts an absolute bust here in round 26. At the number 11 spot, we had Big Yawners taking Troy Anderson. This one kind of sucks because he had so much potential and he started the season doing very good. He looked like he was on line to be a great pick, but unfortunately for Big Yawners, he got hurt 2 games into the season, and after that, you never really got a chance to see him again. So I can't put him any higher than the number 11 spot and a bust. But if it makes you feel better, Big Yawners, if you're watching this, your player still outperformed uh fucking Evan. So we'll move on to the number 10 spot. We got myself, Homeland Security, taking Graham Gano. This is an absolute bust as well. So with Graham Gano, he had games where he just downright scored nothing, scored 2 points, scored 5 points. Uh, then he got hurt at the week 9 point of the season. So overall, he did slightly more than Troy Anderson did, but not much more. At least he played more games, but I don't know how much that's a good thing or not. Um, so overall, I can't call this anything but a bust. I have myself at the number 10 spot. At number 9, we had MILF taking Ryan Tannehill. This is our first quarterback we're going to talk about. Now, you'll find out as we do these rankings that I'm going to be very lenient on these quarterbacks. But with that being said, Ryan Tannehill was just a fucking joke of a player this season. One good game. One. Everything else was shit. And then he got benched for the entire season. And then he got to play again later on, but it didn't really matter. He played like shit again. So overall, this is an absolute bust, but at least he kind of played, and at least he scored 89 points, I guess. But overall, we're stringing up quite a few busts here in this round. At the number 8 spot, I had Mr. Steeler Girl taking Cam Jordan. This is yet another bust. Normally, I love Cam Jordan in fantasy, but unfortunately, for this go around here, he really didn't do much this season. If I can get this thing to fucking load, he really just kind of sat around on his ass collecting cardio for each game, I guess. He didn't do too much to actually put up fantasy points throughout the most of the season. His peak game was week 1, or actually it was week 9 with 17 and a half. Other than that, he really just couldn't get anything done and just was not a good player this season. But I had him ranked above the other players because at least he had a couple games of upside, but still a bust nonetheless. At the number 7 pick, we have Karen's husband taking yet another running back, Roschon Johnson. Um, and this is meh. He had quite a few good games. The problem with Roschon Johnson is you couldn't predict when those good games were going to happen. Week 1, 17 and a half. He had week 12 with 10 and a half. He had a few good games down the stretch of the season. But nonetheless, he was all over the place with his points, and it was just not advised to actually start him. But he had the upside, and for this late in the draft, like I said, getting running backs is overall a pretty bright-sided thing. The problem is this guy just wasn't really startable, but at least he had his games of upside and had a few games of okay-ish points. So overall, I'd call him the lower side of meh. At the number 6 spot, we had Booty Basher taking Green Bay's team defense. Now, with Green Bay's team defense, they're not bad. They're really not bad. The problem is they're not inconsistent, but they don't really get anything special in terms of fantasy points. If you need 30 points in a game, go to Green Bay's defense as long as they're not playing against a ridiculously tough defense. With that being said, they still had their occasional game like against the Giants where they just really struggled for no reason. So overall, they were consistent, but still somehow failed you somehow. In some way, I guess I can say. But overall, they were okay, but they never really did too much to stand out or anything, but they did show flashes of downside. So unfortunately, they're going to be on the slightly lower half of meh. And here, we're going to get into some hits here because we actually had 5 really good takes here. At the number 5 spot, we had Pussy taking Jason Sanders. Fantastic pick of a kicker here. I know he only had 164 compared to some of the other players or kickers that were on the list. But with that being said, after his slow stretch at the middle point in the season, at the beginning and the end of the season, he did very, very well. and was actually one of the highest scoring kickers in the league. And overall, he did very, very good throughout the course of the season. He had a couple bad games, don't get me wrong, but for how few the bad games were, only having 2 2-point games and then a couple 6-point games, I wouldn't say that's that bad. That's actually a pretty good pick if I do say so myself, with the majority of his points coming later on in the season, rebounding from those 2-point games. At the number 4 spot, we had J-Bay taking Tampa Bay's defense. This was definitely a hit. Now, with Tampa Bay's defense coming right off the board before Green Bay, they were ranked number 12 in all of fantasy when it comes to team defenses. They had games where they showed a lot of upside, such as games against Chicago, Tennessee, where they played against Carolina. And it's the same situation as I believe it was the Dolphins from the last round. Or no, it was the Chargers, my bad. Where if you knew they were playing against a bad offense, they could still do good. And if they were playing against other offenses, they still would probably get you around 20 to 30 points. Don't get me wrong, they had games where they struggled, like against Buffalo, like against Philadelphia. But if you're starting a team defense against Buffalo or Philadelphia, you probably shouldn't be playing fantasy football, I hate to tell you. And with that being said, it was still a hit of a pick. They did very well. Then moving on to the number 3 spot, we had Toxic taking Jayden Reed at wide receiver. This is an absolute hit. Probably the best receiver taking this late into the draft. 221 fantasy points. Fantastic. He was startable in every game. He showed off a lot of upside throughout the season. Very few actually bad games. Fantastic player that flew completely under the radar throughout most receivers. Like, I don't think anybody expected Jayden Reed to just go out there and put up numbers like this. But overall, he was out there being a very, very good option at receiver for Toxic's Empire pretty much all season. That was an absolute hit. And hell, if it was in some of these other rounds, Jayden Reed probably would have been the best pick. But unfortunately, we had 2 more absolute studs taken in this round, and we're going to go up to number 2 with Antoine Winfield being taken by PMC Wagner. Another absolute banger for PMC Wagner. I think Antoine Winfield was one of the highest scoring safeties in all of fantasy, and I really wanted to put him at number 1, but the number 1 pick I thought just took the cake on it just for how late the guy was taken. But we'll go over this guy first. Antoine Winfield with almost 300 fantasy points. Fantastic performance out of a safety, putting up borderline quarterback numbers. Amazing pick here. Couldn't ask for anything more or less. The only problem I had with him was that he had a few games where he only scored about 6 to 7 points, but that's not going to take him out of the hit tier, out of the top 2 tier. Like I said, these top 3 guys would probably be number 1 picks in most of these rounds, but this specific round, people just had a glass of wake the fuck up and took some really good players. At number 1, Dictatorship took Jordan Love. Now, don't get me wrong, in terms of sheer value, I would argue Antoine Winfield was better, but for getting a starting quarterback that's one of the better quarterbacks in the league for fantasy this season, in the 26th round of the draft, is one of the last quarterbacks taken, you can't say that's not an amazing hit. That's like saying that you drafted Patrick Mahomes in like the fucking 7th round of the actual NFL draft. Overall, fantastic year all around. He didn't have a single game under 10 points. Oh, he did. 9.98, excuse me. But yeah, he overall just did fantastic this season. Very, very consistent. One of the better starters in all of fantasy. Had a very, very good season. So overall, I couldn't put Jordan Love any lower than the number 1 spot. Now we'll move on to the number 25. We'll probably just wrap things up with this specific round here, and then we'll make another video for the next ones. But at round 25, excuse me, at the number 12 spot, no, it will not be Scrambled and Wiggle Waggled this time. It'll be Mr. Steeler Girl taking Noah Fant at tight end. This is an absolute bust. Noah Fant went out there, scored 73 fantasy points. In the games that he did play outside of the weeks 2 to 4, he just did shit literally all season. He had a good week against Pittsburgh, ironically enough, for Mr. Steeler Girl. But overall, just fucking fell apart after week 4 and just didn't do much, not counting the fact that he was hurt for the first week. But overall, just a shit show of a pick. At the number 11 spot, we have Karen's husband taking DJ Chark at wide receiver. DJ Chark at wide receiver, unfortunately for Karen's husband, had a not necessarily bad quarterback to him. We'll just call it bad quarterback play. Not that it's necessarily Bryce Young's fault or not. Because to be fair, that O-line was just atrocious when it came to the Panthers. But with DJ Chark, he had 112 points, so slightly better than Noah Fant. But overall, with the exception of week 16 and week 3, he pretty much just had a bad year at best, missing quite a few games due to injury. Even when he played, he didn't usually do too much. He had a little bit of upside going into the start of the season, but it quickly dwindled, and overall, this was a bust. At the number 10 spot, we have Booty Basher taking Jawan Johnson. Similar to Noah Fant, just did slightly better to where I figured I'd rank him just above DJ Chark because tight ends are a lot more valuable than wide receivers, especially if you can get a starter this late. With Jawan Johnson, he missed a lot of the season due to injury, but when he was playing, he actually had a good argument to be a starter. He was a little bit inconsistent, as you saw with the 0-point games, 8-point games. But overall, he did have an argument to start, or for him to be a starter. I'm still going to call him a bust just because of how inconsistent he was and how many games he missed. But overall, he did at least have an argument to be a starter, though. That's why I put him above the other players here. At the number 9 spot, I had myself with another bust, Isaiah Simmons, being at the linebacker / safety position. He just did horrible all season. He had a good week 5, he had a good week 11, and then he kind of picked things up at the end of the season for the last 2-game stretch, but overall, he was just pretty much useless all season. Just a very big letdown. I thought the Giants intended on using him a lot more than they did. Unfortunately, they did not, and Isaiah Simmons ended up being an absolute bust for fantasy. Coming in at the number 8 spot, we had Milf taking Hunter Henry. This is yet another bust at the tight end position. A lot of people were taking bad tight ends in this round. He did outscore Jawan Johnson and Noah Fant, but unfortunately, he only had about 4 good games that really carried his points. The rest of the season, he just kind of sucked. Don't get me wrong, he had those 4 games of upside, which is why he's this high on the list for this round. But you take that upside away with those 4 games, and all of a sudden he's one of the worst tight ends in fantasy throughout the games in between. Just a horrible option overall throughout the season. Mike Gesicki took a lot of his passes away, and the Patriots already just weren't a good offense this season. So overall, it really hurt him. At the number 7 position, we had dictatorship with Washington's team defense. This is another bust. A lot of busts in this round. When your team defense doesn't even score in the top 50, you know something's wrong. And Washington's team defense had a good first 2 weeks, an okay middle of the season. But then they lost Chase Young. Then they lost Montez Sweat. Then they lost a few of their defensive players due to injury, such as Cody Barton. And you can just look at the points. When you're scoring, from week 12 to week 14, they scored almost -4 fantasy points total. If that's not telling you how bad this pick was, I don't know what is. The only reason they're here is because against some of the weaker teams, they had a few weeks where they had upside at the beginning to middle point of the season, but that fell off real quickly at the later end of the season, and they became downright horrible. But overall, they had some upside, which is why they're this high on the list, but they're definitely still a bust. Make no mistake about it. At the number 6 spot, not actually being a full bust, this is going to be a meh. Surprisingly enough, I know it took 3 rounds, but scrambled and wiggle waggled is going to take a kicker, Cameron Dicker, and this is not a bust. This is actually a meh. Don't get me wrong, there were better kickers out there, but I would say that this player specifically was a meh. Definitely could have been better, but for everything else taken in this round, this definitely wasn't the worst, and it's not even close. Scoring almost 200 fantasy points, 177, had quite a few good games. He did have a lot of not mediocre games, but a lot of inconsistency with weeks where he had 1, 3, 5, 5, 4. But overall, he had his games where he scored 19, 26, 16. Just overall very good games nonetheless. And I would say overall it balances out to a nice solid meh, earning Scrambled Wiggle Waggled his first appearance on the top 6 on this list. At the number 5 spot is where you're going to have our first hit for this round. We're going to have Toxic Zenpai taking Jamin Davis at linebacker. With Jamin Davis, he was overall a very consistent option. His problem was that I believe he got hurt at some point in the season. I believe it was later on, yeah. But for when he played, he did okay to good in pretty much all of his games. Sometimes he would do just okay. Sometimes he would get like 9 to 7 points, which isn't what you're looking for out of a linebacker. But on those games where he was able to get 18 to 20 points, this is why I'm calling him a hit. For the most part, he was actually a pretty quality player until he got hurt. And he didn't get hurt until the final 4 weeks of the season, one of which was going to be a bye week anyway. So overall, I would say this slightly leans into the borderline of hit to may range, but I'd still give it the slight edge of giving it a hit, especially for this late in the draft. Um, at the number 4 spot, I had PMC Wagner taking Dre Greenlaw. Dre Greenlaw, again, had very similar issues to Jamin Davis with a lot of injuries. You'll notice that with linebackers. Linebackers tend to have a shit ton of injuries when it comes to the NFL. And with Dre Greenlaw, he had a lot of upsided games with 20 points, 14 points, 14 to 20 points. For the most part this season, he actually did very good. He had a few games where he ended up getting hurt and had to leave early, but he usually almost always came back, except for the Super Bowl. He didn't come back during the Super Bowl, and they ended up losing. But overall, he did very good this season, had quite a lot of upside, had relative consistency for the most part, with the exception of games where he would play through injuries or be hurt. And this was definitely a good pick, and this was definitely a hit, to say the absolute least. At the number 3 spot, we had Big Yawners taking Jerome Ford. I really wanted to put Jerome Ford at the number 1 spot. Unfortunately, I think there were 2 players just a bit better. With Jerome Ford, week 1, you kind of ignore that because Nick Chubb ended up playing and he didn't do too much. But after that, when Nick Chubb was hurt, he went in there and ended up being a very good running back throughout most of the season. I would say not a very good, but a good running back, where he gets you around 7 to 10 points at minimum each week with some upside of 20 points. It's all you can really ask for out of a running back, but I don't think it's the best pick on this list. I think it could have been number 1 for this specific set of lists on round 25. On some other rounds, just kind of like a few players we already mentioned already. But for this specific round, there were 2 guys that were taken that I think were just a bit better than him. And at the number 2 spot, you had J-Bay taking Sam Howell. And again, getting a quarterback this late and him actually being a hit is just very surprising, to say the absolute least. 312 fantasy points. I wanted to put him at number 1, but the reason I didn't is because the later stretch of the season, his final 4 games of the season, he scored a combined total of 22. I couldn't put myself to put that at number 1, but he overall had a long stretch of very good games, to say the least. I'd say he's not as good as Jordan Love by any means, but overall it was still a definite hit. And with, again, just finding a quarterback in general this late into the draft that's actually quality, that's pretty hard to do. And then going into the number 1 spot, I don't think there was really much debate about this, was Pussy taking Patrick Queen, the linebacker. Imagine you take what I said about Jerome Ford, Dre Greenlaw, and Sam Howell, and you combined all of it, all of the upside into one player and took away the downside. Super consistent all season. His worst game, he had 9 points, but that's not even horrible. Even with Roquan Smith being out there and taking a lot of his tackles away, he found ways to get a lot of consistent good fantasy points and ended up being one of the better linebackers in fantasy football this season. A very good performance for Patrick Queen and a very perfect pick for Pussy right here at the round 25. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll probably be releasing the next 3 rounds shortly. I hope you guys enjoyed, though. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll catch you guys later.